You're listening to Fateful Years, a history podcast about the modern world. This episode's focus question is, why was imperialism and colonialism important for some of the major world powers? Before we look at 1870 in depth in terms of imperialism and colonialism, it will be quite important to understand what we mean by these two key terms. Often, historians and people alike get these two terms mixed up, and you'll begin to see why this is easily so. The simple way to distinguish these two is to think of colonialism as practice, and imperialism as the idea driving that very practice. In other words, imperialism is the overarching theme, and colonialism is the way of putting that across. So in this first part, I aim to look at how colonialism came onto the scene in 1870. It would be certainly wrong to say that colonialism began with a bang in 1870. The countries of France and Britain had become involved to a certain extent in overseas expansion before this, for instance after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815 and the setting up of the Congress of Vienna. That's aims were to establish harmony and peace within Europe. And pretty much from this point, Britain was known as the shopkeeper of the world, thanks to Napoleon, and the leading force behind industrialization. However, once the other countries began to play catch-up, Belgium being arguably the next, Britain also had to up her game as well. So, effectively from 1870 to about the turn of the century, Britain added a whopping 4.25 million square miles and 26 million people to her empire. Many at the time regarded overseas expansion and adding these colonial territories as millstones around our necks and unworthy of consideration, especially within Africa. However, this attitude changed very swiftly as collective states such as Italy and Germany were gaining nationhood. Cecil Rhodes, for instance, sums this up perfectly when he said, "Expansion is everything. I would annex the planets if I could." Therefore, to say that colonialism began in 1870 would be misguided somewhat. However, there is some sense in stating that it was really around this time that colonialism took on a new lease of life, namely because other European countries followed suit alongside Britain. So how did colonialism and imperialism actually take off then? One of the interesting facts about the issue of colonialism that always certainly sticks into the mind of students when told is that in 1880 only 1/10 of Africa had been annexed by the European states. Jump 20 years on and it's reversed. Only 1/10 remained unclaimed by the European powers. Now that's a fault. It almost seems like the European powers were locusts gobbling up the territories for themselves. It's always interesting to see this progress mapped out on a map of Africa. It's startling to see the rapid speed the colours change on the maps. West Africa almost becomes exclusively French, Southern Africa a mix of Portuguese, Angola for example, and then German and British. This was arguably done with very little consideration for the native population. The same seems to have been the case elsewhere on the globe, China for example, although any student studying this will have to be aware that it is not quite the same situation as what occurred in Africa. What happened in China was that ports and key points were carved up as spheres of influence between the European powers. There's a great cartoon from the time of everyone sat around a cake, cutting it into slices, while a Chinaman stands above, gasping with horror. And this was known as the open door policy, something that we will return to in a later podcast. So with that in mind, let's reflect back on the original question. Why is it then that the European powers became so interested in colonialism?